and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome. I think this is the third in the series of the Keynote Lectures that the Faculty of Education hosts for our first year education students. We've got some other students, tutors, colleagues in the lecture theatre with us today, and you're very welcome. Thank you for coming as well. And the reason that we've got a slightly wider audience today is because we've got a very prestigious keynote speaker who a lot of people are always very interested to listen to, and that's Professor Roger Brown. And one of the aims of the keynote lectures that we host for our first years is to give you, as new students, an opportunity to listen to a wide range of speakers who are talking about all different aspects of education. Roger is an internationally renowned speaker who one of the topics that he regularly talks on is higher education and the context of higher education in the UK particularly. And that's what we've asked him to talk about with you today. Roger has experience in a number of different fields, and he might share some of that with you before he starts. But he was, until relatively recently, the Vice-Chancellor at Southampton Solent University. So he's been very much involved in higher education, very close up for a number of years. And he brings a lot of experience, but also a very sharp academic mind in relation to his own research and writing in the area of higher education. So for the first year students, this is a very different kind of lecture to the previous two that you've had. As we've done in the last 2 weeks, Morgan's going to operate our text wall. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end as part of this group. But there's also, please do text in any questions, as we've been encouraging you to do throughout the lecture, and Morgan will manage those at the end. So I'd like to introduce Professor Roger Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Many thanks, Wendy, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I think it's particularly pertinent that the audience consists mainly of first-year students because, of course, as you well know, and your parents and families know as well, you are the first students to be paying the higher level of fee since the new government introduced higher levels of fees from this year. So what I'm actually going to be talking about is the context in which those fees were increased. You have also got, I'm glad to say, a printed text of my remarks. I'm not actually going to read the text. That would take about half an hour or so. What I'm going to do is to use it as a crib sheet, if you like, to bring out what I think are the key points. That will take about sort of 15-20 minutes. And then the floor is yours, or rather the electronic media are yours, to put questions to me. And if I can't answer questions of detail, I'll be happy, as they say in the House of Commons, to write to you. What I really want to do, in a way, is to provide the context in which you are paying these higher fees. So I shall be talking about the the white paper, the statement of government policy that incorporated the fee changes. I shall talk about other changes that have been introduced. I shall talk about the reasons for them. And then I propose to offer you an analysis of the impact of the new regime so far, because I think it's very important that you understand that the fee increases are only part, and actually from an analytical point of view, not the most important part of these government higher education reforms. And towards the end, I will address my remarks particularly to you, as the most of you are first-year students. Okay, well, the text that you have starts with a quote from the white paper, which provides the government's justification for the changes that it's introducing. I won't read these quotation marks out, your quotes out. You're well capable of reading them for yourself. But basically, the government justifies what it's proposing on three arguments, and this is what I want to unpack today. The first argument is that the changes are necessary for British higher education to be put on a financially sustainable basis. The government recognises that in the past British universities have not been funded as well as they might have been. The government argues that these changes will now put British higher education on a sustainable financial basis. The second justification is that by giving more power to consumers, and particularly to students, the changes will lead to better quality teaching, better quality research. The whole level of quality will be increased. And the third justification is that widening participation will be assisted as well. As you know, we have a situation in Britain and indeed in most other countries where people from disadvantaged backgrounds, poorer people, people from certain ethnic minorities, are less well represented in higher education. And the government claims that the changes it's making will assist with that objective as well, to get a slightly fairer balance, if you like, in the student population. So those are the justifications. Let me quickly remind you of the main reforms that the government has introduced. You're fully aware of one, which is to increase the maximum fee that universities can charge from an equivalent of £3,000 in 2006 to £9,000 now. That's for the full-time undergraduate course. But actually there are a number of other changes as well, and one of them is actually even more important. And that is the fact that at the same time as the government has increased the fee that institutions can charge for undergraduate education, it has also reduced the funding that institutions get direct from the government to support the costs of teaching. So putting it very simply, whereas previously the costs that the institutions incurred in teaching, what it costs, for example, to give my lecture today, was shared roughly 50-50 between the student paying the fee and the government paying a subsidy to the university to provide the teaching. Now, except for a small number of subjects, all of the costs of teaching will be met through the student fee. This is what is called a voucher system, and the UK is unique in major higher education systems are having embarked upon this change, and that is designed deliberately to give you as students, as consumers, more leverage over institutions. Two other important changes. One is that the government wishes to see more organisations entering the higher education market, actually providing courses for students leading to qualifications. It would particularly like to see private companies entering the market to offer degrees and diplomas, and it's begun to make a start on that. And the other important change is that up till now, both the cost of higher education, the fees that institutions charge, and the number of places they can offer to students, to home students, have been controlled by the government. As I say, the fee they can charge has been increased very substantially to £9,000, and the government has removed the controls on the numbers of places that can be offered to highly qualified students, students with the equivalent of AA, B or better at A-level. Institutions can now recruit as many of these students as they like. They're not limited in the number of such students, and that's a partial deregulation of places. Now, all of these changes go to one fundamental objective, and if you turn to page 3 of my text, I quote from the Brown Committee, which was the independent committee. How independent it was is a nice question, but anyway, formally it was an independent committee that preceded the changes that I've described. And basically what they've tried to do is to make higher education as much like a market as possible. Now, you don't need to know any economics, but you will be familiar with the idea of a market where the supply and demand for a particular product is balanced through the price mechanism. And what the government is trying to do is to make higher education as much like a market as possible. And this is on the basis that the government's view is that higher education is basically a product like any other. Markets are the best way of providing any product, any good or service. Therefore, higher education should be made as much like a market as possible. People like me think that's fundamentally fallacious and wrong, but that's what the government thinks. So, how do these proposals stack up against the three criteria that the government itself has put forward, which you'll recall are financial sustainability, improving quality, and widening participation? And that's what I want to talk about really for the rest of this short presentation. I'm going to start with financial sustainability, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail in that than I am on the other two aspects. You'll find plenty of material in the paper. As I said just a moment ago, there is no doubt that historically British higher education has been underfunded. The amount of money that institutions get to teach each student has gone down, and if you compare our higher education system with almost any other major higher education system, we are relatively underfunded. So there is an issue about financial sustainability, and the reason for it is because we've gone very rapidly to a point where we now have almost 50% of young people entering higher education, and at the same time there have been unprecedented pressures on public expenditure, which historically was the main means of funding higher education. So ever since 1980, governments of successive parties have been trying to find ways of easing the pressure on the public expenditure. And the fees that you're now paying and will continue to pay are the resolution for the moment of that particular problem. So there is no doubt at all that there does need to be financial sustainability. However, the question which a number of us are raising is whether the system is in fact financially sustainable. And basically what the government has done is to make the graduates pay for the costs of the higher education. As a student, you pay a fee, but you can take out a loan that you then repay over a period of whatever years, up to 30 years, on certain terms. That defers, therefore, the return to the government. The government, by a trick, only treats as public expenditure the amount of money that graduates don't repay. And the government reckons that about 30% of the money that you borrow to meet the cost of your fees will never be returned to it. Now, I and a number of other experts think that that is almost certainly an underestimate, and actually the proportion is going to be much higher than that. That's a technical issue. I needn't go into it unless you're really interested, but it's one major question as to whether the system is financially sustainable. The other issue is that the government has not allowed for the effect on inflation of the increase in the fee. When the government calculates inflation for the purposes of things like pensions, welfare benefits and so on, it takes account of a bundle of goods and services which include higher education, and we're pretty sure the government didn't take that into account. Together, their misassumptions about the number of people who will repay their loans and the effect on inflation probably wipe out the public expenditure savings implicit in the new regime. I'll say a bit more in a moment about what that will actually kind of mean. There are two other variables that need to be taken into account, which I'll mention fairly briefly. The first is that when you look at the cost of higher education, you have to look not only at what each of you individually pays, but also how many of you actually there are. What the government has been doing since 2009 is very quietly reducing the number of places in the system. What this will mean, therefore, is that participation will go down slightly, and Britain will be once again in a middle range of countries which does not have high rates of participation in higher education. That will have quite bad long-term economic effects, but the government is less concerned about that. The other issue is that, of course, I'm talking for the most of this lecture about the whole higher education, the whole university system as a whole. Of course, you attend individual institutions. There are already quite sharp resourcing differences between institutions. So, for example, Cambridge has about 4 times the income per student of Edge Hill University, and it has 20 times the wealth of Edge Hill University. Because the institutions that are charging the most are generally the wealthiest institutions, those resourcing disparities will increase. That's another consequence of the way in which the government has chosen to finance the system. Now, I've deliberately simplified what is a complicated set of messages, but the basic message is that no one outside the government, or virtually no one outside the government, thinks that the present financial model is sustainable. And I'm warning you now that you may find in future years that you end up paying more for your higher education than you're paying now, because the government can vary the terms of the loan. You have been warned. You heard it first from me. Okay, I can be a bit briefer about the other two issues of educational quality and widening participation. And again, if you turn to page 6 of the text, you'll see a quote from the Brown Committee. Now, one of the features of markets, and you know this yourself when you, for example, buy a car or buy a meal, is that consumers have to be able to form a view about the quality and suitability of what they're actually buying. So if you go into a car showroom, you need to be able to determine what the car is, what it's like, whether it's suitable for you, and questions of that kind. The problem with higher education is that there simply are not quality measures of that kind, not least because each of you brings to your higher education a different set of expectations, a different set of motivations, and different criteria, and also because higher education is really an experience good. You can't really judge the quality of the higher education until you're getting it. You didn't know in advance what kind of lecture this was going to be. You may not even know afterwards, and you may want to reflect upon whether it's been helpful or not to you. That's a good example. And the Brown Committee accepted that was the case, but the government nevertheless believes that higher education operates like any other market, and therefore consumers are in a position to know when they're getting good teaching, good assessment, and therefore can exercise an influence on the universities that are teaching them. And in the paper on page 6, I set out the reasons why I don't believe that is the case. Let me turn finally to social mobility. As I said earlier, one of the problems that we have, and most developed higher education systems have, is that our student population, and even more our academic staff population, do not reflect the social composition of our society. And you know this for yourselves. You know that there are people from disadvantaged backgrounds who are less likely to be found in higher education. In fact, Hope has a very good record in this area. Hope actually meets its benchmark for access and widening participation, but in particular the more prestigious institutions don't. Now the government has put in place a whole series of safeguards to try to protect students from less advantaged backgrounds, including the fact that the terms for repaying the loans are more favourable. And I list those on page 7 of the document, and you can study that. But basically, what the government is saying is that we are conscious of the risk that higher fees will put people off, and therefore we've put in place a number of measures to try to offset that and to encourage students to come. However, there is also very clear evidence that students from disadvantaged backgrounds, poorer families, students who are less well educated and so on, are already very concerned about levels of debt, and I think many of you will be, probably as well. Also, as I mentioned, the government is gradually cutting the overall number of places in the system, which is not going to help many of these students who come in with less suitable entry qualifications. The government has also cut a number of programs and initiatives which you may have been involved in when you were at school or college to try to encourage more students from a wider range of backgrounds to come into higher education. But really important is the fact that the government is also making changes in the school system. And in particular, you probably know that the government is increasing the number of academies and free schools in the system, which is fragmenting the school system, and ultimately, I'm afraid, most evidence suggests will reduce the performance of the school system. And the thing which really holds back students from poorer backgrounds is that they have less good qualifications because on the whole they go to less good schools. The government believes that by turning these schools into academies it will improve educational performance. I'm afraid a number of us disagree with that. So what I've done so far is to tell you what the government's reforms are. I've emphasised particularly the fact that you've all now effectively got a voucher to buy your higher education with. I've described what the government would provide would put forward as the rationale for its changes. I've told you what I think about the government's rationale and how far those are likely to be met. Basically, I don't think that the financial regime is sustainable. I don't think that it will raise quality, and I don't think it will help with widening participation. That is my view. What I think is quite clear is that because of the effects on individual institutions that I've mentioned, the differences between universities, and particularly the funding differences between universities, will get much bigger. Britain basically has a class-based education system. If you look at our school system, you have the public schools at the top, then you have the independent state schools, then you have the comprehensives, and then you have community schools. We have a class-based system of education which is very little different from what pertained in the Victorian kind of period. We are beginning to see that in higher education as well. And so on page 8, I quote from another colleague, Carol Leithwood, and I will read this out because it's quite a powerful statement. And this was writing in 2004, before we had the latest fee increases. The picture that emerges is of a socially differentiated higher education sector, with the elite institutions tending to be dominated by middle-class white and male students, many of whom are from the private school sector. These students benefit from the intrinsic and positional benefits of going to a good university, and the elite continues to reproduce itself with the status of a university increasingly defined by the profile of its student intake. In other words, what I think fundamentally is that the reforms will consolidate and possibly exacerbate class-based differences in the system, so that our higher education system will come to resemble our school system, something which I personally am not in favour of. Okay, well, very finally, I am conscious that most of you are first-year students, and I was asked to direct one or two remarks to you. And I will just say very briefly, first of all, I acknowledge that you are paying more, in fact considerably more, than you would have paid to enter higher education even a year ago. The additional resources that universities will be receiving as a result of those higher fees, assuming that they are genuinely additional, should help them to improve the infrastructure, employ more staff and things of that kind, and should therefore give you a better higher education. However, and also, even given the increased cost of the fees, all past evidence suggests that higher education remains a good investment, both for individuals and for society as a whole. Therefore, I don't think you should have any regrets about entering higher education, and I think British universities will continue to give students a very good deal. But if you take my points about financial sustainability seriously, you may well find yourself paying a bit more than you thought you were paying. Against that, though, is the fact that the personal tax regime that you will be incurring once you start to earn is a good deal more favourable than it would have been when I graduated at the end of the 60s, or indeed any time up to the early 80s. So as always, there's not a clear cut, it's not all one-sided, there are costs and benefits and balances, but I think you do need to take them in the round. So just to conclude, I hope I've tried to explain to you really the context in which you are paying more, the arguments the government puts forward, why I don't agree with them, and then you must make up your own minds as to how you take this forward. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay, a whole range of questions came through then, and statements as well. Maybe if I begin by just running through some of the statements, and maybe you want to comment on them. So one recent one that came through is none of us really know how much we're going to pay. So we're talking about £9,000 tuition fees for many institutions, but that figure isn't actually what we'll end up paying.
No, that's completely correct, because what you pay depends upon what you earn, and you don't know that yet.
Another comment, which is slightly critical, Roger, it says you don't seem to address the problem of very few jobs for students after graduation, and maybe that relates to the last comment.
Well, this would take another lecture, I'm afraid, because of the way in which the government has run the economy, not just in Britain but in many other countries of the West. There is a deficit of jobs, and that is partly a cyclical factor because of the recession, and it's partly a structural factor which goes back to things like changes in technology and globalization. And undoubtedly there is an imbalance between the supply and demand for graduate jobs. However, at least in the past, the economy has always recovered to the point where it's been able to absorb most of the graduates that have been produced. And the other factor I will put in is, of course, you are still better off as a graduate than you are simply as an A-level student.
Okay, another one. Increased fees should mean that only those interested in learning attend university.
Oh, that it were true. I think at my own university, the introduction of fees from 2006 and indeed from 1998 did make students more committed to their courses. But let's be honest with you, not everybody goes to university for pure educational reasons. Higher education has become a rite of passage, certainly for many middle-class students. It's something that you do. And therefore, I don't think, and I'm afraid the evidence is rather on my side, that people take account of the cost of going to higher education when they go in. And equally, the fact that they're paying more may or may not affect their behaviour when they're there.
And quite a lot of comments saying that what you're describing will only entrench existing inequality. And a follow-up question to that kind of sentiment is that what you're suggesting doesn't imply that we've got to get rid of the whole class system rather than just think about higher education policy as you do. So shouldn't you be a Marxist?
Well, on the first point, the answer is yes. I think I was pretty clear about that. Tackling the class system would need a series of lectures, not even another lecture. All I would say is that we don't want to make things any worse, but fundamentally, if we want to do something about this, then we have to increase the public expenditure that goes into the higher education system. As long as we pretend that we can have high quality public services like higher education on very low levels of taxation, both personal and corporate, we will not get anywhere. If you really want to unwind some of the things I've been talking about, you're going to have to pay more in taxes, and companies are going to have to pay more in taxes, and particularly wealthy people are going to have to pay more in taxes. That's as far as I think I want to go on this particular occasion.
Okay. A couple of other points that I'm going to take together. Doesn't this reform reduce social mobility? Only the affluent can afford to go to university, suggested. And then somebody else says, is it fair that we pay, and this isn't my language, £9,000 when the benefit system encourages sponging off the state?
Well, I'm not sure that I go along with the sponging off the state. I think that's, again, a subtopic for a separate lecture. If the Minister were here now, and I'm beginning to wish he was, rather than me trying to justify his wretched policies, he would point out that you do gain considerable private benefits from being educated in higher education. All the evidence suggests that not only will you earn more with a degree, but you'll have a better quality of life. It'll be more likely that your sons and daughters will be in higher education, and various other things of that kind. And actually, an American economist called Walter McMahon has actually valued those benefits, and the OECD finds that graduates earn £55,000 more than non-graduates over a period. That's a relatively low figure, but it still suggests that you're better off by doing that. What was the first question again? Sorry, I answered the second.
I think it was that doesn't this reform simply reduce social mobility?
Yes, well it does, I think, in the ways that I've described.
Okay, this is an interesting one. How can the government cut funding and yet at the same time still control who gets into university?
Because the government has the power of the purse, really, and because the government wishes to limit claims on public expenditure. If it didn't control places, then the system would cost a great deal more money, and probably what the government would then do would be not to pay any more money, and so the amount of money per place would go down. And people don't want to do that for grounds of quality. So I think it is quite legitimate, as long as the taxpayer is contributing what it is to the cost of higher education, for the government to control the overall cost. Now, shifting the burden of funding away from state subsidies to institutions to everything going through the fee doesn't change the equation, because the government is still paying in that it lends you the money to pay your fees and then reclaims the money from you. So there's still a large element of public expenditure in the equation, and I think therefore it is right for the government to control the aggregate numbers of students in the system.
Okay. I don't know what you want to say about this one. Why do you think that Liverpool Hope is only charging 8,250 rather than 9,000?
Because Liverpool Hope made a judgment about how much income it would need to replace the funding that it previously had from the government via the subsidy that I've mentioned, and it believed and believes that it can provide an adequate higher education at that level. I'm not privy to these discussions, but I think it highly likely that in fact in a year or so's time, not only Liverpool Hope but most universities will be charging the full 9,000 at least for some of their courses.
Okay, one that's just come through. These statistics on graduates having a better life, and I think this person means higher income and so forth as well, are based on a life that doesn't really exist anymore.
I think there is a good deal in that, and what has been noticed is that although in general you're better off as a graduate than if you are, for example, someone who leaves school with A-levels and then gets a job, there is an increasing differential between graduates getting high-earning jobs, particularly in the private sector, particularly in areas like financial services, and graduates going into public sector professions, as many of you will do, as teachers, social workers, psychologists, etc. To be fair to the government, the way in which the repayment system works, as I'm sure you know, is that if you're not earning £21,000, you don't pay anything at all. And after that it is graduated. So there is a system, there is a sense of equity built into the system. If you earn more, you pay more. It may be that will be accentuated in what happens in the future, because I can't, unless you charge graduates more, I don't see how the sums can be made to add up, because you think about it, you don't want to reduce any further the number of funded places. You still want to have some subsidies to institutions. What else can you do? The only thing you can, if you don't want to raise taxation, which it always comes back to at the end of the day, if you don't want to raise taxation, how else do you make the sums square up? And I think whoever comes in the next government, or maybe even the next minister, is going to have to look at that issue quite carefully.
Okay, final thing, somebody's obviously been listening to the news today. Isn't Alan Milburn recommending a sort of EMA for university students?
Well, there is a sort of EMA for university students already. Hands up those who know about the National Scholarship Programme. Ah, well, there you are. There is something called the National Scholarship Programme, and obviously, if you've heard about it, you're probably benefiting from it. And I haven't read Alan Milburn's report. He may well be proposing that. When the government announced it was abolishing education maintenance allowance, I and a number of other people objected. I'm the chair of governors of a big sixth form college near Southampton, where I live, and we were very cross and angry when the government announced it was cancelling education maintenance allowances, because there was evidence that they helped people to stay on in school, at college, and then to come to university. All I would ask is, where is the money for these educational maintenance allowances coming from? If it's coming from the taxpayer, then obviously it's going to increase the amount of taxation. If it's coming from institutions, as some of the money for the scholarships does come from, then it's taking away some of the additional income they got through tuition revenue. So it's the usual question, where does the money come from?
Okay, this is the funniest question so far.
Oh, good.
Can you finish on a positive note?
I think the answer to that is with difficulty. I think there are one or two positives. I think that it is right. When I was a Vice-Chancellor, there were 14 of us who signed a letter to The Guardian opposing the introduction of variable fees in 2006. And I think that was the right thing, because I believe, as an old-fashioned socialist, if you like, that the costs of higher education should be met from general taxation, because they provide general public benefits and goods. However, there is also an argument from equity that if you as private individuals benefit from higher education, you should contribute to the cost. The American economist McMahon I mentioned believes that about half of the cost should be met from tuition fees. You're actually paying considerably more than that, but you are also in turn being subsidised by the government. If the new regime does result in universities having a bit more money, then I think that's a positive. I think that's highly arguable, and as I say, I think there are many disadvantages to the present plans, and I'm hoping to talk with people between now and the next general election to see if we can get a slightly more balanced set of policies that will make life a bit easier. I certainly don't think that the tuition fee should be more than $6,000.
Okay, so I'd just like to say I hope that people like Roger can have some influence over the direction of travel. Fingers crossed for that, and I'd like to thank him for speaking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions.